Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we are continuing on with the second piece and chapter 2 of Freshly Ground Coffee by arxaris. Over the next several months, Bakugo settled into his new normal with Kirishima. His mornings were nowhere near as quiet and anonymous as they used to be, but he found he didn't necessarily mind all that much. Kirishima was getting better and better behind the counter. At some point, he'd stopped asking what Bakugo wanted and instead started telling him what drink he was currently perfecting, which would thereby be Bakugo's order of the day. Bakugo was becoming much more well-versed in coffee than he had ever wanted to be. He was also becoming well-versed in Kirishima. His unwillingness to disclose personal information about himself didn't hinder Kirishima's efforts to befriend him, so instead of asking questions, the redhead tended to fill Bakugo's mysterious silences by talking about himself. He kept Bakugo well informed on all things Kirishima, entertaining him with stories of his ridiculous customers, his laughable dating endeavors, his cats, his crush on Ground Zero, and seemingly anything else that happened to come into his mind as he prepared Bakugo's coffee. In the midst of all that, Kirishima still somehow managed to find time to trick Bakugo into revealing information about himself as well. He had seemed to understand early on that Bakugo wouldn't talk about anything too personal, so instead he kept it light. Before Bakugo had even realized what he was up to, Kirishima had learned his favorite color, what type of books he'd like to read, that he was terribly uneducated about all things movies and TV, and he had even gotten him talking several times about mountain climbing. Even now that Bakugo could tell he was slowly weaseling his way into his personal life, though, he was just as helpless to stop him. When Kirishima glanced over at him from the espresso machine with curious eyes and a question on his lips, it was like a switch flipped inside Bakugo, and he was answering before he even remembered he was supposed to be filtering himself. And truthfully, he didn't hate it. He'd be lying if he said he didn't still feel that same rush of disappointment when he walked in on Kirishima's days off to see Mina behind the counter, or if he pretended he didn't perk up when Kirishima would suddenly walk in while Bakugo was there on his days off to pick up his paycheck. Or if he denied being a bit smug about the fact that picking up his paycheck was an act usually accompanied by Kirishima sitting down with him while he finished his coffee for seemingly no reason other than to talk to him. Bakugo wasn't stupid. He knew what all this meant, and it scared him a bit. Not because he was afraid Kirishima didn't reciprocate his feelings or whatever. Kirishima was pretty obvious. His flirting style was about as subtle as being hit over the head with a fucking frying pan. But rather, he was apprehensive because he could count the number of crushes he's had in his life on one hand and still have plenty of fingers left over. He didn't have much experience in this field, and he was pretty sure he didn't want much either. Frankly, actually pursuing Kirishima seemed like a lot of effort. It would mean figuring out how to ask someone out on a date. It would mean figuring out what a date even was, for that matter. If things went well, it would eventually mean revealing his true identity and dealing with Kirishima's fanboy reaction. But more importantly, pursuing Kirishima would mean letting someone in, and that sounded messy. What if they were to hit it off? He'd never shared his space before. And what if Kirishima was a bed hog or a slob? What if he didn't do dishes immediately after eating? He'd also never considered someone else when making decisions. What if Kirishima got weird about his hero work? What if Bakugo needed to move for his job at some point? Would they break up? Would Kirishima move with him? Fuck, what if their cats didn't get along? Dating seemed exhausting, and Bakugo honestly just wasn't sure his feelings for Kirishima were strong enough to make all that worth his while. He was far more content to just let their whatever it was continue developing slowly and naturally. If it was meant to be, it would happen, he supposed. But since it was more likely it wasn't, there wasn't much need for him to do anything about it. This way, If his feelings got too strong, he could simply pull back, no harm done. This way, Bakugo had all the control in the world. Well, almost all of it. He still hadn't quite managed to get his damned hoodie back. Time passes. The first morning of December found Bakugo in his usual seat at BeansPot Coffee, the one nearest the heater, bundled in a thick sweater and reading another paperback novel. He was drinking some seasonal bullshit Kirishima had pushed on him, coffee laden with peppermint and just a bit of chocolate. He'd never tell him, seriously, he would go to his grave telling him it was way too much sugar, but it was just as amazing as everything else he made for him. For once in the long, long time Bakugo had been coming to BeansPot, the place was actually decorated for the holidays. He had a sneaking suspicion he knew who was responsible for that development, and he'd somehow managed to make the austere room look fucking cozy. Bakugo was equal parts impressed at the achievement and nervous about the influx of customers it would almost certainly bring. Bakugo had the day off, so he was in no particular rush, and he took the time between the short chapters of his book to watch Kirishima work. His hair was loose today, and his roots were starting to show. Bakugo couldn't help but notice that he'd been wearing it down more often ever since he had complimented it one morning when Kirishima had apparently been running too late to style it. Well, if you could call saying it looked less shitty a compliment. Anyways, he was wearing an older Ground Zero shirt from one of the first lines Bakugo had released after going solo. It looked soft and worn, hugging his body loosely in the way that only well-loved shirts could. Bakugo's lip quirked as he pictured it on a much younger Kirishima, wide-eyed and excited for the new purchase. It was probably a lot bigger on him back then, judging by the way it strained slightly over his biceps now as he worked the espresso machine. Bakugo watched idly for a while. Kirishima was a natural behind the counter, flawless in the way he could make breezy conversation with customers while preparing the most complicated orders, never forgetting a thing. He'd grown a lot since that first day when a cappuccino had presented too many challenges for the doe-eyed barista. Eventually, Kirishima caught him staring and flashed him a grin. If Bakugo didn't know any better, he'd say it was just a tad softer than the one he used for everyone else. Bakugo rolled his eyes, but he couldn't quite help the smile that stretched over his own face. Breaking eye contact, he went pointedly back to his novel so Kirishima couldn't make fun of him. Content in the warmth of the coffee shop, with the taste of chocolate and peppermint on his tongue, Bakugo continued to read for a while, until the sound of Kirishima's soft laugh pulled him from his thoughts. Bakugo felt his lip tugging upward automatically as he glanced up from his book. His eyes fell on Kirishima, standing at the register and talking to a customer. Bakugo's smile faltered as he took in the man, built and blonde, and leaning over the counter towards Kirishima, clearly flirting. Then his smile fell completely as his gaze shifted back to Kirishima and then registered his body language. He had an arm tucked around his middle like he was trying to make himself look smaller, and his other hand was fucking twirling a lock of his hair. You know, the hair that was loose in the first place because Bakugo told him it looked nice? Sort of. Bakugo let his book fall closed without marking the page, eyes glued to the interaction in front of him. He watched Kirishima punch the guy's order and set about preparing his drink. He strained his ears but couldn't quite make out what they were saying. He could only tell that they seemed to have eyes for no one but each other, as Kirishima poured filtered coffee in a to-go cup for him. Placing the lid on the drink, Kirishima slid it across the counter to the blonde. His hand lingered, much fucking longer than necessary, as the guy took it from him. Luckily for Bakugo, the heater chose that moment to shut itself off, and he suddenly could hear their conversation. "Black coffee, huh?" Kirishima was saying, in a voice Bakugo didn't like one fucking bit. Then he did the goddamn hair twirling thing again. "I can't drink it like that. You're so manly, dude." Oh. Yeah, Bakugo was going to kill him. Despite the fact that being called manly was objectively a weird fucking compliment, the guy was straight up beaming now. Bakugo hated it. "Can I get you anything else before you go?" Kirishima asked, and the guy opened his mouth with a shy but determined look on his face. Bakugo leaned forward in his seat to catch the guy's response. Then, he nearly jumped the hell out of it and onto the floor when the heater kicked back on with a soft bang. Both Kirishima and the customer turned briefly to look at him, and Bakugo went beet red as he yanked his paperback back open again. When he chanced to glance upward, the pair was focused on each other once more. As it turns out, Bakugo didn't even need to know what the blonde had said to get the gist of what was happening as Kirishima scrawled his number hastily onto his cup. Oh yeah, Bakugo was going to kill him, all right. It didn't take long after the guy left for Kirishima to come out from behind the counter, humming under his breath as he wiped off the tables. He seemed happy, and Bakugo hated the twisting feeling in his stomach caused by the same smile that he'd found contagious only a minute ago. Bakugo resolutely pretended to be reading as Kirishima slowly worked his way towards the corner. In reality, he was simply glaring a hole in the same 5 words on the page. Finally, Kirishima got to his table, reaching immediately for the remains of his peppermint latte. He hummed, looking down at the half-drunk coffee. "Not a peppermint fan?" Bakugo felt his jaw tick, and he dropped his paperback, turning to glare at Kirishima. "Just didn't seem all that manly to me." Kirishima's smile faltered, and his brow knit together in confusion. Only a second later, though, a look of realization watched over his features, and the grin was back in place. "Aw, Blasty, are you upset that I called black coffee manlier than the stuff you like to drink?" he asked. He placed a hand on Bakugo's shoulder, giving it a light, comfortable squeeze before continuing. "Don't worry, bro. I think your drinks are plenty manly. I was just flirting." Bakugo blinked up at him. Once, twice, and then a third time, as he tried to fully soak in the extent of his idiocy. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Bakugo took off his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose, attempting to stave off the sudden headache he could feel coming on. After a second, he turned back to Kirishima. "You really are as dense as a fucking brick, aren't you?" he snapped. Then he grabbed his paperback roughly from the table and stood. He pushed past Kirishima to make his way towards the door, growling a thick, "I'll fucking see you tomorrow, Kirishima," over his shoulder as he left. Time passes. Except Bakugo didn't see him the next day. He didn't see him for several days, and he had the shitty Starbucks takeaway cups overflowing his office waste bin to prove it. The first day, he'd still been angry with Kirishima. He figured if Kirishima wanted to flirt with other guys in front of him, he didn't really need Bakugo around for anything. Then he'd made the mistake of accidentally half confiding in fucking Deku about it, giving him short growled responses when questioned about why he'd been in such a shit mood at work, happier than usual to kick some villain's ass while acting even shorter and snappier than his regular self on rescue-style missions. Of course, it hadn't taken Deku long to piece together his sentence fragments into a more or less accurate story. He'd been less than impressed with Bakugo once he had. "So let me get this straight," Deku said, eyeing him over the brim of his own Starbucks cup. "There's this guy, Kirishima." "Shitty hair," Bakugo interrupted. "Kirishima," Deku went on pointedly, "and you guys sometimes flirt when you go to the place where he works." Bakugo gave a curt nod. "Okay, I see. Well, except it's you. So I'm going to take a wild guess and say the flirting is actually one-sided and that you've given this guy practically nothing to go on other than maybe not biting his head off like you would do with everyone else." Deku paused, and Bakugo glared at him. Eventually, he continued. "Right, okay. And on top of that, he's made no bones about the fact that he's dating other people." "Yeah, and he's no fucking good at it. He's always picking fucking losers." Deku blinked at him, and Bakugo hadn't loved having his "you really are this dense" expression turned back on him. After some threatening remarks from Bakugo, Deku got on with it. So you're jealous because this time you not only had to watch it, but it seemed like it was going well for him. And even though you're too scared to act on any of your own feelings, I'm not fucking scared, he lied. I wasn't finished, Midoriya said bluntly. Even though you're pussyfooting around, don't look at me that way, you know you are, you still want him all to yourself without giving him anything in return. Bakugo blinked at him, face heating. When exactly had that fucker gotten the balls to talk to him this way? And more importantly, where the fuck did someone like him learn the word pussyfoot? Feeling angry and called out, Bakugo stood with a growl, crushing his empty cup and throwing it into his bin. Deku took the hint and followed him, accepting his dismissal with grace. Bakugo had slammed the door to his office shut behind him when he left, then sank onto his couch with a groan, wondering if Deku might have had a fucking point. So, for the next few days, his absence from BeansPot was fueled by guilt rather than rage. He took some time to mull things over, trying and failing to pinpoint the exact moment his feelings had spiraled out of control. In the end, he came to the conclusion that there wasn't a single moment. He'd fallen for Kirishima slowly, one caramel latte at a time. Quietly, but forcefully, so that by the time he'd realized anything was happening at all, it was much too late to intervene. Admittedly, though, Deku was right about him not giving Kirishima much to go on. He'd never fucking done this before, okay? He had no fucking idea how to flirt, and he honestly couldn't see himself trying. What he could maybe feasibly see, though, was him manning the fuck up and asking Kirishima out, getting over his fears, and finally making the first move. Oh, and he probably owed Kirishima an apology for, as Deku liked to so gently put it, pitching a childish fit. So he resolved to do just that, and he more than happily tossed his last Starbucks takeaway cup away. Time passes. Bakugo pushed open the door to the coffee shop, grateful for the stark change in temperature as he stepped inside and closed it behind him. He stomped the first snow of the season from his boots while the bell above his head rang out, signaling his arrival. With his nerves dancing in his gut, Bakugo looked to the register. He knew Kirishima would be there. He'd long since learned his schedule by heart. Still, though, the sight of him had his heart leaping into his throat with anxiety. Kirishima was busy steaming milk at the espresso machine and hadn't seen him. Bakugo took a selfish moment to drink in the sight he'd denied himself for the past week. Kirishima had his hair loose again, wearing it in a low ponytail, and it seemed that he still hadn't found the time to tend to his black roots. With a sharp pang in his chest, Bakugo realized that his hoodie, which had become Kirishima's regular work uniform as weather progressively got colder, was nowhere in sight. The one he had on, instead, was noticeably too large on him, and Bakugo felt his chest heating a blotchy red as he remembered the blonde from before, and thought of the potential implications. Bakugo shook his head to himself as he started towards the register. "One thing at a time, idiot," he mumbled to himself as he watched Kirishima place a lid on a takeaway drink he'd just finished preparing and push it across the pickup counter with a smile to its waiting recipient. The customer took it and thanked him, and Bakugo's heart hammered against his ribcage as he bade her goodbye and turned back towards the register towards Bakugo. Kirishima's eyes fell on him. For a second, he almost didn't seem to register that it was Bakugo, but then they went wide, and Kirishima actually stopped in his tracks. Shit. Bakugo had hoped, rather selfishly, that his behavior had caused minimal damage, but by the way the blood seemed to be rushing from Kirishima's face suggested otherwise. "Hi," Bakugo ventured, voice cracking roughly around the word. He cleared his throat awkwardly as Kirishima jolted back to life and walked stiffly to the register. Fuck. "Hi, Takahashi-san," he responded. Rather than making eye contact, he seemed to be looking at a point somewhere on Bakugo's forehead. "Fuck." "How are you?" Bakugo asked at the same time that Kirishima said, "What can I get for you?" Bakugo's heart sank in his chest. Surely he'd misheard that. What did you say?" Sorry, Kirishima apologized, very polite but devoid of his usual sweet humor. I asked, what can I get for you? Bakugo's heart hit the floor of his stomach. Kirishima hadn't asked him that question in months. You mean you don't want me to try something new that you're working on? He asked quietly, sounding a little desperate as his gaze bored into Kirishima. Finally, Kirishima met his eyes, head tilting and brows contracting as the corner of his mouth lifted in a nonverbal apology. Not today. Oh. Shock making him dumb. I guess I'll take a cappuccino then. He had an entire speech planned out. He was going to apologize, and if it didn't feel too soon, he was going to ask him on a date. Now it seemed the only question exchanged between them for the day would be his order, because Kirishima didn't appear to want to talk to him at all. He paid robotically, and he couldn't help but notice that Kirishima seemed relieved to be done with the interaction as soon as he pushed his cappuccino over the counter at him a few minutes later. Bakugo watched helplessly as he drank his coffee in the corner, missing the sweetness of Kirishima's usual concoctions. He was completely his usual smiling self with every other customer, and a few times Bakugo caught him smiling down at his phone. A few times they made eye contact when Kirishima to sense him staring, and even as he hastily lowered his gaze, Bakugo couldn't help but notice the way that the smile instantly fell. Shit. Time passes. After letting the initial shock of Kirishima's anger sink in, Bakugo went back to BeansPot the next day. He was determined to try again, to properly apologize for his outburst and start mending their friendship. He'd hardly slept at all the night before, and the hurt look on Kirishima's face from when their eyes met across the shop had floated in his mind's eye until the early hours of morning. He knew he'd acted like an ass, thrown a childish tantrum. He'd expected Kirishima to be annoyed, maybe even a bit pissed at him, but he hadn't anticipated how hurt he seemed. Kirishima had always bounced right back from Bakugo's insults and his short nature, but he'd looked at Bakugo like he'd kicked his puppy square in the face, on purpose. Bakugo reached the door to BeansPot and pushed it open. Heaving a deep breath, he could see Kirishima's hair through the glass window, and he caught his eye immediately upon stepping inside. Rather than moving to take off his coat, he found himself glued to the spot, biting his lower lip and searching Kirishima's face desperately for any sign of reaction. Unlike the day before, he didn't seem shocked to see Bakugo. The blood didn't drain from his face, rather his cheeks turned rosy, and he averted his gaze for a second before he seemed to force himself to make eye contact. Maybe with a different context, the body language would appear shy and demure, even flirtatious, but Bakugo could still see the hurt and discomfort marring his pretty features as he looked back to his face. Hi, Kirishima, Bakugo said, doing his best to tame the tremor in his voice. Hi, Takahashi-san, Kirishima responded politely, though there was a hint of resignation there. Cappuccino? Sure, Bakugo replied quickly. I really don't care. Okay, that'll be 300 Kirishima, can we talk? Bakugo interrupted, then through gritted teeth, please. Kirishima's brows shut up as a deer in headlights expression came over his face. I guess. Why? Bakugo let out a breath and lowered his allergy mask so Kirishima could see his mouth, unconsciously digging his nails into the countertop with the other hand. He rushed out the words he'd practiced all night. I want to, apologize, he said quietly, jaw clenching shut automatically as soon as he was through. Bakugo couldn't quite bring himself to look him in the eye while he was speaking, but after a few seconds of silence on Kirishima's end, curiosity and nerves got the best of him. He looked up anxious and was met with a confused expression. He raised a brow, which seemed to remind Kirishima he was supposed to be responding. For what? He blurted, looking at Bakugo like he was an absolute mental. Both Bakugo's brows shot up at that. Huh? What do you mean, for what? Bakugo asked incredulously. For for getting all mad at you, for calling you dense. Fuck. God. For storming out on you. Kirishima's lips parted in clear surprise, just for a second, and then he was sucking the bottom one between his teeth as he thought. And goddammit, Kirishima, now was not the time to look so fucking adorable and unsure and fuck. Bakugo just wanted to fucking hug him or something, anything to restore his usual sunshine smile. That's all right, Takahashi-san. It was no big deal to me, Kirishima finally said. Bakugo's jaw dropped. What? Seriously, Kirishima continued. When it became clear Bakugo's speech functions weren't working, I'm not, mad or anything. You don't need to apologize, but I appreciate it. But, Bakugo sputtered. But then, why? What? Kirishima turned even redder. He opened his mouth to respond, but that exact moment, the bell above the door chimed, overly loud for the quiet of the early morning. Bakugo jumped backwards from his spot, leaning over the counter, flinching as if he'd been caught in the act of some grave wrongdoing. Sorry, Takahashi-san, Kirishima said, sounding relieved, and already looking over his shoulder at the new arrival. He started to say something more, but Bakugo cut him off. Just Takahashi, he said, glancing away. He added, I don't want honorifics from you. Kirishima looked back at him, brows drawn together. For a second, he searched Bakugo's face without speaking. Then finally, I don't think that's appropriate, Takahashi-san. Have a seat, and I'll get your drink out right after I help this next customer. Bakugo blinked stupidly. A full 30 seconds passed before accepting his dismissal, stalking away numbly. When Kirishima brought out his cappuccino, Bakugo tried to stop him so he could finish talking. However, by the time he was setting the saucer down on the table, 2 more customers were in line, so he stammered out an apology to Bakugo and rushed off to get started on their orders. Bakugo watched him as he drank his coffee without tasting it, feeling confused and defeated. Kirishima said he wasn't mad at him, but he was clearly avoiding him, and Bakugo would be lying if he said his refusal to drop the honorifics hadn't stung pretty badly. Bakugo had fought countless villains, taken part in bringing down some of the worst ones Japan had ever seen during his tenure as a hero. However, even after all that, he wasn't sure he'd ever felt quite as helpless as he did right then, without a clue why Kirishima was acting the way he was, and unable to get him to even speak to him long enough to start figuring it out. Just as the shop died down for a minute and Bakugo was contemplating going back to the counter to try again, the door chimed once more, and a smiling blond man about his age entered. With a sinking sensation, Bakugo recognized him as the man who Kirishima had given his number, the start of this entire fucking mess. His hands were fisted under the table as he greeted Kirishima by name, and Kirishima returned it with a warm smile. What the actual fuck? Ready? The blonde asked him cheerfully. No, absolutely not. Yeah, Kirishima explained. Let me get Mina and grab my coat. Bakugo's heart sank into the pit of his stomach as he watched Kirishima disappear through the back door. This cannot be fucking happening, he thought, and somehow feeling half numb and half desperate. Kirishima reappeared with Mina and without his apron, pulling a jacket over that goddamn oversized mystery hoodie of his. No, fucking no. Kirishima and the blonde shared a hug, and Bakugo watched in a trance as the pair walked out the door. The bell jingled loudly and cheerily overhead. Kirishima didn't look back. Bakugo didn't realize his mouth was open until Mina was suddenly there, gently pushing it closed while collecting his empty cup. He jumped lightly, head whipping around to meet her gaze. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I've tried to talk some sense to him, but he won't listen to me. Bakugo wanted to ask her to elaborate, but he was too shocked by the sudden sensation of tears stinging his eyes. It's fucking whatever, he spat gruffly. However, the way he stood abruptly and shoved past her, not looking back until he was halfway down the street towards his office, probably made it pretty damn clear that it was absolutely not whatever. Somewhere along the way, he chuckled, slightly hysterical, as he wondered how the hell he'd ever convinced himself he could just as easily pull back from Kirishima if his feelings became too strong. Fuck, he mumbled under his breath, lip trembling. All right, friends, thank you so much for listening to Chapter 2. Please join me next time. We'll be continuing with Chapter 3. This fic has 4 in total, so we're halfway there now. I hope you guys enjoyed this piece. I know it left off a little bit angsty. All right, so I hope you'll join me for that next piece. And if you do, I'll see you next time.